Right. And here we are live for another ESTA Live. Excited to introduce and interview my friend Anthony Gaud. Anthony is the CEO of G3 Esports and on our board of directors at the Esports Trade Association, heading up our regulation committee. Anthony, welcome, and I'm excited to talk with you today.
Hey, how you doing? Glad to be here today. This is exciting. We got an hour to talk about a whole bunch of different topics that we kind of briefly touched in the green room. So this is exciting, and I am really honored to be, spotlight, and the spotlight.
Yeah, we can go with that.
Spotlight. So let's go to town.
Fantastic. So for everybody who's listening, if you want to put any questions in the chat, if anything pops up, we'll get to those if we have time. But to start out, Anthony, let's give everybody an idea of your background, your origin story in gaming and esports before, how'd you get to where you are today?
Oh, wow. Sure. Well, I went to the University of Cincinnati, and when I attended the university, Hasbro was a couple of blocks away from the school. It was in the same city, Cincinnati. And I did an internship and was hired by Hasbro when I did my senior thesis on a project called Snow Crash, which was a book by Neil Stephenson. And it was about the future, like what's going to happen in virtual reality. And I think he coined the word metaverse and some other words that were used for the first time. And it's a great novel. I just recommended it to a friend not even a month ago. And it was written in 1991. And it was what my senior thesis was, designing all the technology for Snow Crash.
Oh, wow.
And from that, I was hired at Hasbro. I worked on a whole bunch of different things there. I worked on Transformers, bringing back Beast Wars, Beast Machines. We worked a little bit on Batman. We worked on Men in Black. Bunch of stuff that's Hasbro related. Back then toys were much bigger than they are now. People forget that the toy industry was everything back then. So we also did a lot of movie exploration. So we did a project for Lucasfilm to regain the rights. We were in a battle with Mattel to get the rights back to the Star Wars license, and we won. We did a little bit of a digital film. We brought SGI workstations. We used those for the first time, so that was fun to show Lucas on the true potential of what we thought the Star Wars license could be, different from what the the original trilogy was. From there, I worked on a show called Transformers with Mainframe in Vancouver. I was hired on, kind of transferred from Hasbro to Mainframe, and was art director in a show called Reboot for season 3.
Cool.
Which was the world's first computer-generated television show. So I worked on that, War Planets, which was called War Machines here in the States, 2 seasons of Transformers, Beast Machines, a season of Beast War, or 2 seasons of Beast Wars and 1 of Beast Machines. I get confused. And a few other shows. From there, I transferred over to a studio in Boston. We worked on Asheron's Call, the first MMO, online MMORPG.
Mm-hmm.
It was and that was around the same time that EverQuest came out from Sony. So Asheron's Call 1 and Asheron's Call 2. I worked at the very, very end of Asheron's Call 1. We did Asheron's Call 2. We did a bunch of other projects, and the studio was eventually sold to Warner Brothers, I think.
Okay.
So I left before that. I created my own independent company. So we facilitated designs for the game. So that's usually what I do as an art director. I do the designs for like the set design, the character designs, the colors, the robots, the characters, what are they wearing, and we do it in a very toyetic sense so that all of them stand apart from each other.
Yeah,
that was how my early career started. So when I left the Turbine Studios in Boston, my company had a contract with them to keep developing game designs for them. And the company expanded from just doing game designs. We also started writing television shows. It was something that I had experience with, and the team that I worked with had experience with working with Mainframe. I think Mainframe, our shows won like 5 Emmy Awards at that time. And then we decided hey, we could do this ourselves. So we started developing television shows, and we sold 3 shows. 2 of them went on the air. 2 of them won Hugo and Emmy awards. One of them, unfortunately, didn't get on the air. Very similar. It would have been very similar to a show that came out recently on Amazon called Invincible. It was about. It was just fun. It was about a father and son relationship with a superhero. But that was the fun side of things. When you're developing story and character design, there's very little business involved, and you go and you do your job is to stand out from other people.
Sure.
You do a lot of research. You do research on all the other properties. You do research on art styles. You do research on what's popular. You do research on the zeitgeist. And then you try to design characters and even the visual look of the show to be a little different from something else so it catches people's eye.
Mm-hmm.
Like, visual style is one of the attractors when you're doing television. And that was a really fun time. I wanted to get...
How old were you at that point?
Oh, God. Mid-20s.
Mm-hmm.
Mid-20s. My first company that I started was that studio that was at first it was an independent studio that working for Turbine. As we expanded, it became a little bigger in scope, and we pitched Comcast on our television shows, hoping that they would, at the time they were getting into creating. Comcast used to be just a cable company. They only did, facilitating of cable before in internet. And we had heard, because they're right around the corner. I live in New Jersey. They're about 45 miles away in Philadelphia. So a friend of ours, one of our investors, actually worked there and did the advertising for them. She did the "I'm Done with the Dish" campaign, which is really famous. And we set up a meeting, and they said, "Look, we really like these show ideas. We're not going to give you the money to make them." So that was kind of depressing. What they did say was that we'll give you what we think is even more valuable. We'll give you your own network. So we'll give you the ability to put these on the air. You'll have to find the funding, and we'll give you the ability to put them on the air. But it's going to be something called video on demand. And it was
never heard of it.
I had not heard of it either. But it was something that Comcast had developed and wanted to tell people about and wanted to kind of promote that service. So we had worked with Comcast to, first of all, they had to explain how it worked to us. And then when we realized how it worked, I started looking for partners to try to get investment in it. And also because these shows are very expensive.
Oh, yeah.
Even a low end animated show may cost $5 to $10 million for 26 episodes. And that's a low end sort of done on flash, low budget ish show.
Well, I can imagine you're going through the pilot process, right? Because once you get funded, once they take on the show, then you've got budget to produce it. But before that, when you're hoping that it gets bought, you're probably investing a ton of money, high risk, high reward, I'd say.
A lot of risk, and if it works, it works. And there's a lot of pilots that are, you spend $1 million on a pilot and it doesn't go anywhere.
Wow.
And a lot of them are internal costs to the studio. So we had several ideas for shows. But when we got the network concept, what we did was we split the shows. So we did eventually put the shows on the air, one through Disney, the other one through Discovery Networks. But we still had the concept for the show, for the network. So we grew that out, and it was tough. Like, we were telling people this is video on demand, and people would come up to us and say, well, why would anybody watch something when you could already put it on the air? It's already, why they had Nickelodeon. Why would they watch Nickelodeon on demand? And you would have to try to make the argument like, well, you can watch it when you want to watch it. And then the other part that I thought would be a selling point to advertisers, and it wasn't, it was the exact opposite. We would tell them, you can know exactly who's watching with exact, like, you will know the exact number. So a lot of the Nielsen.
There you go. That's huge. Yeah.
A lot of the Nielsen numbers are sort of created from what people want them to be.
Here's a question for you.
At least back then they were.
Because devil's advocate, I might say, maybe I don't want to know exactly how many people are watching, because maybe these assumed numbers are a lot higher, and then that's what sponsors are paying a higher dollar for. Was that the case, or was it something different?
That was exactly the case. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to know how many people are watching, because when they create these ranges, they say, well, we're on the high range of this, and there's no way to prove it. There's no way to prove otherwise. So we had a very tough time at first to find sponsors for the show. And what we ended up doing, we ended up working with a major brand and said, look, we'll give you free advertising. And once people saw that we had ads from this major food chain, people assume, well, they must be paying. So, and if they're in, then we'll go. And it's just sort of like that, sort of like FOMO, everybody else is doing it, we'll do it.
Perception is reality, right? That's like such a huge takeaway. I think just the fact that nobody wants to be first.
Yep.
Right. We see this in all sorts of industries.
But it brings a lot of burden as well.
You're one of the smart ones. But, like when it comes to sponsorship or, there's something new, everybody's kind of waiting to see who will put their foot in. And sometimes you can be strategic to give somebody a great opportunity to be a first mover. And it helps them because they're getting in early, pennies on the dollar, but it also helps you because somebody says, oh, wait, you have a sponsor? They're involved, they're invested. Okay. They must be doing something right. I feel comfortable getting involved now too.
It works the same way with investors, which we'll talk about later, I suppose. But it's always that first one is the toughest. And at the time, nobody wanted to know the real numbers. So once we brought in that sponsor, it made it a lot easier. And eventually, the channel still exists today, and actually, it expanded into 3 channels. So Cabillion, which is on Comcast, it's now on Warner. It's on, it's everywhere. And I'm really proud of it. You'll see me on LinkedIn post about new shows. We are the home for the Hasbro shows, Transformers, G.I. Joe, and other shows that debut there. But it was something that we wanted to do because we were the first. And the same thing goes with the 3D graphic shows, Reboot and Beast Wars. Those were the first. And when you do the first, there's that blue ocean that gives you the wide opportunity to be successful and make something of it. But there's also the fact that you have no idea what you're doing because there's no path there's nothing to rely on.
Right.
There's very few experts, if any, that can help you. There's questions that you can only settle and solve through experience of going through something in order to resolve that issue, because there's no example from previous things that you've done to be able to give you that answer. I mean, it's exciting and it's really, really tough at the same time.
Well, and I think a lot of people would hold themselves back from taking those risks, those things that are very stressful and the unknown. But it sounds like whether it's your experience or the way you're wired, you seem to just kind of jump out in the unknown. Have you identified why that is?
No, but it's a personality trait. There's no way I can't change that. Even when I was at Hasbro, I didn't want to be one of the staff designers. I wanted to bring in computer graphics to replace people working with pencils, right? So I did that. And you always will find a lot of, I got in trouble constantly. Somebody told me I'm either going to be rich or in jail or both. And a lot of the reason he thought that, jail was because you're just always pushing the boundaries. I don't break the law, but you're always pushing the boundaries of what people want or expect or are comfortable with.
Yeah.
But if someone didn't do that, then the problem, everything just stays stale. So I think it's a personality trait. You can't really change it. There's been a lot of times that I wish I could just sit at a desk and just take a regular design job, which is, I mean, my degree is in industrial design and engineering. Just do that. But
you can't help yourself, can you?
Can't help myself.
Well, speaking of the unknown, there's plenty of unknown in esports. So why don't you make this link for the audience here? How did you go from developing these television shows and networks to then getting your start in esports?
Well, I'm trying to make this quick. We sold the television, the VOD network. And I started something new after that because I couldn't help myself. And we started a video game studio that was acquired eventually by Walt Disney Interactive.
There you go.
So
heard of them.
That studio was partially located. It was a partnership partially with Nexon in South Korea, Seoul, South Korea. And when we were there, working in the offices there, one of the things that was evident was that one, Seoul is the most advanced city on the planet, as far as I know. it's just an amazing place. That the city is as large as New Jersey, it seems.
Wow.
It's big. It's really big, bigger than people really that I've ever seen anything like it. It reminds me of Coruscant from Star Wars. And you go there enough times, you realize that a lot of the television channels are just esports, people playing StarCraft. Video games are, or like what we see professional sports here, even back then, which was about 2009. Back then, video games were everything back then. So when we went to lunch, the team and I went to lunch one day, and I tell the story a lot, but there was a commotion across the street, and you always know when something's going on, like, what are those people looking at over there?
Sure.
And it was somebody said, well, that's a StarCraft player. And I said, StarCraft, the video game StarCraft? I would, like, did he kill somebody? Like, what's going on? And he said, oh, he's a professional StarCraft player. I go, what? A professional StarCraft player was a new idea to me. So at the hotel room, we started watching these events, and I thought, this is really exciting. People are playing video games. Are my number one passion. I mean, I know I do design and I've worked in films and TV, but this is really what I love is video games. And to have video games taken seriously was never a thought that occurred to me. Like, I never thought that video games would be played professionally. It was just like wanting to have $1 billion. Like, it's just too good to be true.
Sure.
But here was a person, I forget who the person was, who was a professional video game player who had a bunch of fans following him in a public street in Seoul. So that gave me the idea to kind of pursue this. So when I sold the studio to Disney, we worked there for a while, and when I left in 2018, we started a esports company here near Atlantic City called G3 Esports. It stands for Gaud Gaming Group. That's what the 3 Gs.
And what year was that?
2018, the end of 2018.
So there's a bit of a gap between seeing that first StarCraft player and then
well, I mean,
launching the company.
There's a lot of stuff that I'm trying to jump ahead for time to the esports part, but between that time, we also owned a company that did advanced concepts for gambling for major studios. So we did they called next gen concepting. We had another company that was in a partnership with a gambling company, but we also had the Disney studio. So the Disney studio, without getting into the details of it, because we want to jump to the esports, we did a lot of games there. I was there. We were bought weeks before they bought Star Wars, and then we actually landed a few Star Wars projects. We worked on 3 Kingdom Hearts projects for like 5 years. We launched several Marvel projects, Marvel projects, and saw all the rest of it in development. So we had Star Wars, Marvel, Kingdom Hearts, and Mickey. We worked on Epic Mickey as well. So we had a lot of stuff that and it was great. You're working with Disney. You can go into the vault, where you have working on Kingdom Hearts. When you're going into an older property, you can ask to have access to the vault, which is the actual artwork that was created for the movie.
Wow.
You have to put a mask on. You have to wear gloves. They take you, they escort you. It's pretty neat. And then you get to hold in your hands the actual painting for Peter Pan, which I did, and you see the scribbles and the artist notes and stuff. And it's like, oh my God, this is the actual thing. So that was cool. But
better than an NFT.
Well, we'll get into that. So that was, but what we wanted to do, I mean, we were online gaming company. So we did free to play online games, and we had, we would have 100,000 concurrent players back in Korea. And then we went to the US, we had a very high number of concurrencies as well. So in the way that you define what esports is, you could say, hey, there was an aspect of esports in these massively multiplayer online games. There's a lot of cooperation, but there's a lot of combat too. There's a lot of tribes, and there's a lot of teams that the clans that play against each other. And I think one thing that you'll hear from me all the time is that we need to redefine what esports is, because it isn't just these 10 titles. It isn't just, Rocket League and Fortnite and League of Legends. It's also these other games. It could be competitive Tetris. Why not? And in Europe, sometimes it is. And, if you go and you watch the Tetris championships, just go on YouTube, there's 13 million viewers. Right? Yeah. So this is not a small spectator sport. People really like this stuff. But when we left Disney and started the esports company, our goal was to bring some of what we saw in Korea to the States. So we should probably talk about the differences in a second, but we created the first public-private partnership between an esports company and the city, in this case, Atlantic City. So we held events here in Atlantic City in 2019. We held the Collegiate Esports Collegiate Star League Finals.
Yep.
We had the Halo Championship with UGC Esports. We had the Esports Travel Summit. And then COVID canceled our biggest event, which was an epic Fortnite event with the American Heart Association.
Wow.
It was supposed to happen in May, and then, as we all know, I think it was March when COVID just shut everything down in 2020.
So, a question for you: what was how receptive was the city of Atlantic City with esports? Was there a lot of pushback, or were they pretty open-minded? I know just about every city in the U.S. is saying, "I don't quite understand this. How does this make sense for me?" There's a few cities that are proving the value. But what were those first initial conversations like?
I mean, it's the risk of being the first one again, right? So it's always the risk of being able to explain the benefits of something that the people you're speaking with have no idea that even exists. And if they do, it's just, partial knowledge of this space.
Right.
So it was tough. I mean, it took a lot longer, and I almost gave up several times, because people didn't. I mean, I remember being in front of, because we were a public-private partnership, a political group, not a government group, not a political group, a government group, and somebody, that had their glasses on, we're asking for approval for this budget, and they're like, why would someone watch someone else play a video game? It makes no sense to me. And I said, well,
what is your answer to that? I'm curious, because I've got a kind of a typical answer I give, but I'm curious of what your response is.
Well, my answer back was, do you watch baseball on TV? And this person said, yes. I said, it's the same thing. It's like you're watching someone else do something that you can do, but they do it at a much higher level. Right. And I said, it's the same exact thing, just a different sport.
Yeah, I always, to take it another level deeper, I say, if you pay attention, we watch people cook food on TV on the Food Network. We watch people talk about politics. We watch people on ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports, not just play sports. We watch people talk about the sports that they just watched.
Watch Kardashians. I mean, what's that about?
That's right. And we also, every day of the week on TV or watching a movie, we watch people pretend that they're people that they're not. And so it all comes down to, is it something that's relevant to you that is really interesting? And so people typically just don't make that tie with traditional sports, and to take it a level deeper of other forms of entertainment. In fact, I always say, it doesn't even matter if you consider esports a sport or not. That depends on your specific definition. What it is, whether it's a sport or not, depending on your definition, it's entertainment, and it's relevant to youth worldwide.
And I think that's exactly right. That's where my interest in it is, that I've done traditionally just entertainment products, right? So it is entertainment, and people forget that all of the time.
That's right.
All of the time. And it's more complicated. Actually, esports is probably the most complicated of all the entertainment venues. I mean, it's more complicated than just video games. It's more complicated than sports. It's more complicated than streaming. It's all these things combined. Plus, you have the age issues. You have issues with COPA. You have issues with, the compliances of having anybody under the age of 18.
Sure.
You have issues of the publisher rights, which, we'll talk about hopefully. You have issues with the cost of the events. You have issues with every single thing you could possibly. You couldn't find a more difficult field, but yet companies have learned. Some companies have learned to move forward and generate revenue. Now, for us, when we did the events, they did really well. And they did well for the city. They put the city, we had a couple of articles that came out, Forbes and Business Week and other, I think New York Times had articles about Atlantic City and esports, and Atlantic City is competitive with other cities that have gambling, because we're a destination resort, right? So we're trying to find ways to bring people here, as opposed to them going to Pennsylvania, New York, or Virginia for wagering. And we thought here, the city thought this is a good idea. Now, the casinos back then, the city, politicians, very few were supportive, but enough were that we got it passed. And from those efforts, we actually were asked to speak about this thing called the upcoming A637, which is the esports wagering bill. So we were asked to provide research for the bill. How should it work? What issues are going to be the most important issues? What should we avoid? Those kind of things. And how does it tie into esports? And how does esports compare to sports? And what about age verification? And just a whole bunch of issues that came out of that experience. When COVID hit, we had to stop our events, clearly. And it provided an opportunity to be able to work on this wagering side that really became the crux of our business.
So what I'm hearing here is, so you have this experience with entertainment and TV shows. You have some experience with the gambling and the regulation and betting side of things. And then you have this interest in and experience in gaming and then esports. Tell me why joining ESTA and leading the regulation committee within ESTA was the right decision for you.
I don't. So, one of the things that you're getting used to since 2020 is primarily working at home. And I have done that for a long time anyway. But one of the things that I don't like doing is traveling to a summit for something that doesn't require me to, I don't like going places if it's not going to lead to something.
Right.
So I just see a lot of summits for esports that I don't really need to go to. And the reason I don't need to go to is I hear a lot of people talking about things like esports wagering that don't have as much information as I do. So already there's no need for me to go.
Sure.
Or people that may or may not benefit my project, but not at this time. And a lot of the experience that we've gotten is hands-on experience. So hosting events, developing technology, working with casinos and regulators and lobbyists. A lot of those things are very difficult to obtain at these summits, right? So for me, I don't like traveling to shows other than for entertainment. So I'll go to Comic-Con. I actually host Comic-Con panels, but they're just for fun. We're not doing anything I'm not learning anything, but the first time I think that I learned anything was at the Esports Trade Association Summit. Last year. Was it last year?
It was last year. Yeah, September.
The whole years run by my mind now because of COVID. And it was the first time I said, hey, I'm actually learning something that I would not have learned on my own. And the ability to communicate that to other esports companies was very, very important to me. So a lot of summits they'll have mixers and they'll have, exotic locations and they'll have drinks and stuff, but I don't really care about those things. I just want to get something done. So it's like a means to an end thing. So I think for me, the Esports Trade Association was a means to an end. I felt that, I proposed that we could do the regulated video game and esports committee, which is about it's wagering, because I thought, hey, I need to do this anyway. Doing it with the ESTA provides me a backdrop of authenticity, but also connects me with the people I need to be connected with. They provide the structure, they provide they do a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm just talking. And a lot of the heavy lifting is provided by the ESTA. And at the time, as we started to organize this regulated video game and esports wagering space, the ESTA will support the companies that are members by providing the resources they normally wouldn't have on their own. So I don't see I don't see the ESTA in the same way as I see a summit of something somewhere else, because I see it as a working group opposed to a one-time thing. And that's why I joined and proposed to work with the ESTA, because it was a very different experience for me. I see that as an extension of my company, if I could put it in those terms.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that. And I remember when you told me that at the conference, it's just super validating, because our entire goal is to provide value and, give people a real reason that benefits them to join. So I appreciate that. Let's get into a little bit of what you're doing with the committee. So to set that up, not everybody understands the current state of regulation and betting in the esports industry and the challenges. So can you help people understand that before we move on to talk about some of the solutions we're developing?
I will do my best, and I will keep it at a helicopter level, because it is very complex.
Yeah.
Right now, you can wager on video games really in 2 states legally, New Jersey and Nevada. There are other states that have adopted esports. I don't know if they started esports wagers. So it may be more than 2 states. I haven't checked literally within the last week. It changes very, very quickly. A lot of states are coming into the esports video game space. Yeah. But the question is, what is the esports wagering space? So right now, for most people, their understanding of the esports wagering space, and this goes for casinos and regulators as well, is something like the ESL, championship or League of Legends championship, a big major event that you're watching like someone would watch a sporting event, that you wager on the players and who's going to win, who's going to have the most headshots, who's going to have, you're wagering in a third-party event. You're not participating. That is the way that esports is set up now primarily. But the reality is it should be much, much, much more than that. It should be you and I playing, a game of Tetris. And in a few years, it should be you and I playing a game of Tetris with a verified user profile where other people can wager on us playing, right? And it's playing any game. Tetris, you want to play, Battleship, the digital Monopoly, it doesn't matter. You'll be able to wager on these things as iGaming products. There are, I think, 41 states allow for skill-based wagering.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of debate whether skill-based wagering is gray market, meaning that there are about 14, 15 states that will allow esports wagering through iGaming. That means you have to be licensed.
What is it? Can you define iGaming?
iGaming is internet gaming. So it's sort of like, slot machines, poker, blackjack, those kind of things. So those states require that operators are certified and licensed. So you have to go through a process of licensing your company, assuring that you have what they know, KYC, know your customer. You have to verify the age, the location, how much money they spend, keep records on everything, even verify the relationships that customers have with other customers. So if you play at this level with one person, but at this other player level with somebody else, is that because you're intentionally throwing the match? There's a whole bunch of different things that you have to go into when you're licensed. Responsible gaming, meaning if somebody opts out, you have to make sure it has a gambling problem. They can't come back in, because that's the whole point of opting out, that you prevent that person who has stated that I have a gambling issue, I can't stop. We have to supply the tools in order for them to not be able to get back on, even if they wanted to. That's the whole responsible gaming part of it. So there's a whole bunch of layers to that are costly, expensive, and require experiences that are very different than what most game developers or platform developers have done. So in those 41 states, there are products that operate that you can play, for example, Fortnite for money, or Counter-Strike for money, or Tetris for money. And a lot of those do not have any, significant levels of KYC or anti-money laundering, what's called AML, or responsible gaming. So we're in the position where, as we explain what wagering is, and we'll talk about that in a second, we're also trying to explain that there's a bigger world here than just the third-party wagering. There's a pari-mutuel wagering, there's peer-to-peer wagering, there's a lot of other things, but all of them require safety system to be in place in order to do it the right way, to make sure nobody gets hurt and to make sure that there's nobody under the age of 21.
Right. I think that's a big part of it. Not everybody is really aware of betting and gambling. And so one thing that and I'm not either. So it's been really eye-opening to me as I've attended some of these meetings to hear the very specific definitions that people are asking. In fact, we hosted a private regulators meeting the other day with about 30 regulators from all across the country. And the specificity of the questions on definitions of all of these different things just opened my eyes so much that, number one, if we want this to be responsible, if we want it to be safe and regulated in the right ways, you need somebody like yourself, like Eric and Harry, who are your colleagues in this, who have experience on both sides, both understanding gaming and esports, and then also understand the wagering side. And very few people have that experience.
And the legal side, and the regulator side, and the legislative side. Right. So it's like all these different things that come in. I mean, we were in a meeting last week with the state where we were looking at a definition of what is esports and moving words around to come to the right definition, where the word here means this, but the word here means this. And that's sort of the legislative side of things, right? Because that creates the framework for everything that follows underneath it. And it is very difficult. It is. And every state has their own way of doing it.
Right.
So part of what the Regulated Video Game and Esports Committee is set up to do is to get questions from regulators. Last week's event was fantastic. We have, we saved the questions afterwards, and we are going to send out a response to those questions. But the questions are indicative of two things. One, there's a lot of excitement about the space. Two, very few people know what the space is, right? So there's this big group of people, the video game audience, that's like, goes all the way up to like my mother, who's 73. She plays Zelda. She plays video games more than I do, and all the way down to the 21-year-olds.
Sure.
And eventually, the bigger audiences with Gen Z that as they get older will be able to wager. It's a bigger space than iGaming. It's a bigger space than esports. Video games is the biggest entertainment medium on the planet. But how you combine that with wagering is a very, very difficult thing. And I think a lot of companies have come out and sort of jumped the gun on offering products because the space isn't ready yet. Right? So the space isn't ready in multiple different ways, right? There are no leagues set up for wagering. The data is not set up to be official and verified. The structures aren't in place to make sure that the equipment's all the same. Eliminating bots, eliminating, DDS attack, intentional DDS attacks against players to slow their, a whole bunch of different things that no one really knows.
Right.
Well, people know, but there's no framework for it yet. So we're still years away, hopefully not too many years away from creating this space. But it takes a village, which is why we did it through the ESTA, because we need experts in technology. We need experts in operations on the ground. We need experts in tournaments. And we need the publishers on board to some extent. And we need to understand where the profit margin is here in order to build the business, because we think that wagering is actually what esports needs to become successful, to turn the corner when it comes to profitability, because you'll see a lot of investments in the esports space, but you see very little profits. And one of the things that we draw on is, in the Ken Burns documentaries about baseball, is that baseball really relied heavily on wagering to become profitable in the late 1800s. And that's why data and statistics are so tied to the sport, because there's that what's his batting average compared to, all of these things kind of come in and create a story that was really favorable for wagering to be added to it. And it was a perfect mix. And we feel that esports is at the same point.
Yeah. And the fact that everything is digital, you can measure it much more specifically than maybe traditional sports, at least in the past. It is super cool to hear your perspective, because somebody without this background might say, yeah, I want to bet that Optic is going to beat FaZe in the next Call of Duty League match. Like, what's wrong with that? And there are all of these teeny tiny little details that have governments involved, which is super serious. I want to get your take on a couple of the responses in the space to this being built out. One of the questions here in the chat is, how much do you think wagering will help the industry grow among a more mature demographic? Currently, we see a lot of fans are young kids, and older people typically just don't really get it. But this is now connecting something that they understand from a traditional sports standpoint. We're seeing the great lift in revenue in traditional sports as a result of wagering as well. So what's your answer to that question?
I think it depends. Well, the average, let's define the average. The average video game player is, I think it's 33-year-old male and a 36-year-old female, something along that range. So that's the average age.
Our thought of it is 13-year-old kids, but when we look at the actual numbers, it's older.
Yeah, and it's become ubiquitous, right? So it's sort of like anime. The idea that anime is only for kids is wrong, right? It's actually primarily an adult activity. In Japan, it's for adults for 50 plus years. So it really depends on your outlook, but the facts say different, right? So again, I talk about my mother at 73 playing games every day. I think that the growth of esports is dependent on finding a revenue model that works to sustain the companies that do the tournaments, right? So their wagering helps, because wagering can generate higher revenues than entry fees, than event ticket pricing, the t-shirt sales and stuff, right? So if you have the right event, you can generate a lot more viewership too. When we did our first event with the DGE, we facilitated the first wagering event. I think it was Allied Esports Entertainment Group, and G3 Esports. All of us together did the first event. And we only got approval for the event the night before the event aired. I was actually at Disney World. So we couldn't promote it, because we had to get approval from the DGE for every single, they'd never done it before. So, and then we had to go to the teams and get them to sign waivers for the players that they weren't under the age of 18. And they were like, well, why should we sign these for them? What's in it for us? So all these things were happening within a 2-week period of time. I went on vacation. And on the first day, we got the event approved. The event went on, and it was an online event because it was COVID time. But I had 1.7 million viewers. It was not broadcast. It was not advertised.
Wow.
But people really wanted this thing. So if you can have that sort of viewership, and what happens in Katowice, you have hundreds of millions of views for those big events. Those 1.7 million views for an unannounced pilot event is a pretty good indication of the of where this is headed. And if it's done right, where the audiences will be. Now the trick will be to expand it, right? So part of the allure of the Super Bowl is that you have people that aren't just football enthusiasts wagering on it. You have, people who don't even watch a sport, who look at these sort of party wagering tables and go, oh, if the first quarter ends in a 3 and a 7, you get, and I think a lot of it is just is designing systems so that it's not just for people who understand wagering lines and over-under spreads. It's gamifying wagering in a way to make it easier for people to play, to have fun. So the way that we look at it, and you said it earlier, it's entertainment. So we want to be able to provide entertainment that doesn't take advantage of the people behind it, because ultimately, if you do that, then I think it's immoral. But if you're willing to spend, we watched Sonic the movie the other day, fantastic movie. But you take 2 kids and your wife and popcorn and their friends, it's $100 for 2 hours. So you're looking at per hour $50 per hour entertainment value. And if you're trying to look at it from that point of view, that's what we're doing. I mean, Dave and Buster's has provided great entertainment value for playing video games. It's sort of wagering when you win those little tickets and you've redeemed them. And it's not cheap. You're not walking out of Dave and Buster's with less than $100 in your pocket that you had before.
Sure. Well, I'd love to get your take on some of the, the revenue, the monetization results of this as well. What I see in the esports space, the biggest challenge is monetization for everybody below the publisher level. And you touched on it a little bit with that comment about, you guys had to wait for this event to be approved. And that's not the case in traditional sports. If you and I wanted to host a football event or a basketball event or baseball, we could do that, right? We couldn't use the logos or the IP of the NFL, the NBA, or Major League Baseball, but we could do John and Anthony's, traditional sports extravaganza. What we see with the publishers is they're typically making so much money on sales of the game and other things that they can use esports as a marketing loss leader. And so you get way more sales of Call of Duty, for example, because you see Scump, making choking signs and winning championships. But it doesn't matter that they're losing money. However, everybody in that ecosystem, the teams, the league operators, etc., there's a lot of investment. There's a lot of sponsorship revenue, but there's not a lot of profit. How do you see figuring out the wagering side of things, enabling those who are in that unprofitable ecosystem to then make significant revenue?
That's a loaded question. There's so many different ways to look at that. One is the issues of the publishers, where the publishers are indifferent and sometimes antagonistic to the operators, right? And then even in that scenario, you still see operators exploit the situation. We all read the stories that came out in the Washington Post today. It's a tricky situation when you make the availability of your product potentially limited. It makes it difficult for that product to be ubiquitous like a sport is, right? Anybody can pick up a football and there's a football field. Even if it doesn't have lines, you can still say that corner, that cone is the end zone, and that, but with esports is a little different, right? Now, the difference is that people play games more. And I don't think we've figured out how to do that. And I think part of the ESTA's mission should be to figure out some happy middle ground between what the publishers and the studios are doing and what the community is doing. Mm-hmm. Right now, the two are often at odds.
Yeah. Right?
And where it's different in Korea is that the Korean companies like Nexon fully embrace the community. Mm-hmm. And their model's a little different because they have in-game items or microtransactions. So they want to embrace the community, have a constant flow of money. But one of the stories that I like to take back from Korea is that when Kartrider, if you don't know, Nexon's Kartrider is very similar to Mario Kart. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more expansive, but it's very similar. It's an online game you can play, and I think it's going to be available on consoles this spring. But when it released, the new releases of a Kartrider come out, it creates such a frenzy at the schools that they had to move the releases to non-school days because kids would ditch school to go to 7-Eleven and pick up game codes and then go home and play the game. Right? So it became a national frenzy. And that was because they have a very synergistic relationship between the community, and it becomes your game. We make it, but it's your game. Right now, we don't have that relationship with very few. I mean, Velen Studios with Knockout City is fantastic. But the publishers worry about, well, what happens if you get an unruly company? What happens? And it happens anyway. As we, the Washington Post today, it still happens, even if you get the license and they give you money. So I think we just have to develop a better relationships between the community, the operators, and the publishers. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we're not Korea, right? We don't, we in Korea, a lot of these gaming centers, South Korea, a lot of these gaming centers operate because you don't have a lot of private space at home. You don't have 2,000-3,000 square foot houses. It's a very big city and space is at a premium. So to get out of the house, to get your own rig, gaming rig, you rent a computer at the local, internet cafe, and your friends are there too, because they're also leaving the house. And it's a different kind of, you walking a couple of blocks is very different than asking your mother to drop you off at the gaming center.
Sure.
And I think the model doesn't replicate as well as people think it would for the US. So I see a lot of venues creating esports centers, and I personally don't think they're going to be successful because they're not taking into account the fact that the American audiences, North American audiences, are just different audiences.
Sure. Yeah, we always need to account for these cultural differences. I always use the example of Disney. And so I remember studying this when I was in marketing school, how Disney's first international expansion was to Tokyo, where in that city, they just eat up American culture. So the rinse and repeat of exactly what was happening in Orlando worked amazingly well. And they said, oh, we've got a smash hit on our hands. Everybody loves us. Let's do the same thing in France. And they do not eat up everything American culture. In fact, even the employee requirements having to be clean shaven and things like that were applied to a country where people typically have facial hair and things of that nature. So I do agree with your point. It's really important to understand the unique cultural nuances with different countries, different cultures. And still being very, very bullish on esports, but at the same time, understanding what works somewhere else tremendously is not just a rinse and repeat situation here.
Yeah, and Microsoft and Canada did the same thing with the Xbox in Japan. Microsoft primarily has a bunch of shooter games, and I love Xbox, but it is a lot of shooting games. And in Japan, those games are not as popular as the story-driven games that Nintendo and Sony make. So the market share just isn't there for those kind of games. And I know Microsoft's making a lot of changes now, but historically it has been difficult for them to find a foothold in Japan. And I think part of what's going to drive the revenues up for the esports companies in the States is adapting to what, you got to go to where the audience is, not where you want them to be. And if you want them to move somewhere else, you got to give them something that they want. So in this case, we do believe that wagering and the ability to win money is a big motivator to get people out of the homes, right? At least I think so. Part of the issue with online tournaments for money is that you don't know, you can't control things. You can't control bots that may be on the system. You can't. We talked about it before. It's an unknown environment, and then latency is uncontrollable to a large extent. Even though I know that there are some technologies that are coming online to try to equalize it, for the most part, I know that my son has been in competitions where his skills were secondary to the latency of a system that was perhaps in Nevada and he's playing in New Jersey.
Right.
So, when you see
that's why we see Fortnite pros moving to North Carolina because they want to be right next to those servers.
Yeah. And so that's why, exactly. So you get into a lot of issues that you can't control. So physical venues benefit from the fact that you can control everything. Right. And if you're playing against each other, the internet isn't a factor anymore. So I think in time, as we develop these models and these frameworks, you'll see a maturation of the space where you're going to see a lot of people bow out. Like, we're talking about the scholastic space and the collegiate space. It is very hard to make money in that space. And it's hard because you have very little control over the events that you can run.
Yep.
You have very little control over what you can call the events that you can run. Is it a league? Is it a tournament? Is it, it's all definition of a lawyer, right?
Sure.
You have very little viewership because everybody's fighting everybody else. There's all 25 different organizations all fighting for the same market share, and viewers have no idea what to watch.
Right.
There's a lot of different things that make that space difficult. So, I predict there's going to be a consolidation of that space, which is needed.
Sure.
And you're going to see more success in that space. But the publisher aspect has to be something that is worked on, because without a close publisher community relationship, it's still going to be hard for companies to make money, organizers to make money.
Absolutely. Well, this hour is going fast. We have about 5-6 minutes here. I'd love for you to just express a little bit of your experience at last year's Esports Trade Association conference, because that's where you and I met. That's when, like you said on this ESTA Live, that's where you learned some new things and said, I want to be part of this group. Can you share with the audience who may be on the fence, am I going to, come to Chicago in August? What are the reasons to come? And, what was your experience there?
Well, I think the experience, it mirrors what I said earlier, that you have conferences that just repeat what makes people feel good and bright optimism. Everything's going to be great. Look at the future, world of tomorrow kind of thing. And those are good if you want to justify a trip away at the company's expense.
Sure.
It's something you can write off. But I think most people would prefer to have a working group of similar-minded professionals who are operators, who are technology vendors, and now, regulatory and legal experts in the space that can help solve whatever your problems are. At least they'll already understand. They don't have to have a start from zero understanding of it, and can not only provide potential solutions, but potentially partners that can help you solve those issues.
Right.
And I think that's the big difference. If you want to actually get real work done, you come to a trade association. If you want to just entertain yourself, go to a fancy summit poolside. Well, they could be fun, but I'd rather go and get, as a CEO, you want to get things done.
I really appreciate that. Anything that we should be on the lookout for you, whether that's the committee, whether that's G3 Esports, what can people look forward to? If there's anything that, is not under NDA.
There's a lot of stuff, but we can't talk about it yet. I think in June, you'll see our big announcement, which I think is a welcome one for the space. I'll just preface it by saying that a major media group really needs to take esports seriously. So we've been working on that part of it for a long while now, and I think we're ready to announce it. And part of the mission of this media group, which is a well-known media group, is to say, look, we're going to take esports seriously, and we're going to take the good and the bad seriously. We're going to promote those that lead the space to help them get exposure. But we're also not going to be fan people about it. We're going to, if there's issues that we need to resolve, we will put that out in the open also. But it's a way for us to all be on the same page. So we want to be able to wake up, find out what's going on, be able to see what are the schedules for events today, this week, tomorrow, because that just even knowing what events exist is a difficult proposition.
Right.
And I want to be able to feel that I'm part of something bigger. If you're an esports activist or esports organizer or esports player, and that project will be announced in June, and I think people will be very happy about it. The other project will be announced probably also in June, actually, and it is an esports wagering project with hopefully a very large partner that we can announce. And we're doing esports wagering the right way with all the security and safety of iGaming, actually a much higher level of security than any iGaming product, because we want to make sure that nobody comes to harm from having a good time. That's
great. Well, we really appreciate that. What are the ways that people can follow you or your company in the ways that you would like them to?
G3esports.gg is our website. You can find me on LinkedIn and send me communication there, or Godzilla RX is my Twitter account, but I usually just talk about innocent things like video games and movies because I try to stay out of trouble. I think if you're on Twitter and you say what you really think, you have like 25 people coming after you pretty soon. So I keep it to movies and video games.
Perfect. Well, Anthony Gaud, CEO of G3 Esports, board member of the Esports Trade Association, and chair of our Regulation Video Games Committee. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience with the audience.
Thank you. It's been a great time.
All right. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.